The Future Unwritten. Chronicles of Change. By Elton Gar. Warren dumped the bucket of rusted nails and twisted metal into the collector. As it ticked up from 98 cents to 106 cents, he felt a moment of joy, far more than when he earned enough to eat for the day. He glanced at the massive metal and glass tower with the Vexus Enterprises sign prominently displayed, and then at the statue of its founder, Tyler Dentron. Inside, executives moved with confidence. Silently, he thanked them for the chance to add those precious cents to his savings. He then took off his rented gloves and put them in the container. After a second, it said,
2 cents of wear deducted from pay.
He smiled, relieved that he still had enough. He tapped on the touchscreen and scrolled down the list. There were hundreds of places he could go. Some included servants, guards, and in one, he was a pilgrim walking to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. All of those were far too expensive. He had searched carefully and found the cheapest of the vacations. After 10 years of cutting corners and calories, he had earned enough to pay for it. A bare-bones trip to only 35 years ago. So he scrolled to the year 2025, double-checked that he had enough in his account, and pushed the buy button. A small plastic card extended from the screen, and the computer said,
Report to Autodoc 43,923 for preparation for time travel.
Warren hadn't known a visit to the doctor was part of the cost of the trip, but he followed the small, glowing light that led away from the Vexus headquarters towards the hospital district. As he reached that area, he saw a smaller but still impressive statue of Tyler Dentron. In this one, he held a staff with 2 snakes and wings at the top. Like all the statues, it marked entering a new section of the city. They were designed to help people like Warren, who had never learned to read well, to find their way through the city. He hadn't come to this section of the city for a while. Medical scraps were generally worth less than industrial scraps, but because of that, they tended to build up so you could get a large haul if you timed it right. Just outside of the medical district, he passed by a factory. He instinctively glanced inside and saw one of the robot workers pushing a broom. There was a small pile of dust, but he also caught the gleam of a bolt in it. He almost rushed to grab the bolt, then remembered he was on vacation. The light on the card led him past the better autodocs. He couldn't afford an autodoc with that low of a number, even if it was part of his vacation package. So he turned down an alley and went through a metal door, wiping off the grease and oil from the handle onto his pants. It was a Generation 1 autodoc. Its lack of mobility explained why it was here, and hadn't been moved away from such a valuable section of town. The digital face on the front of the screen smiled as it saw him, and one of the 3 large metal arms clamped around his wrist and pulled him into the bare metal chair. The second robot arm then pinned Warren's other arm to the chair as well, and the doctor said,
Don't worry. This won't hurt much.
After only a few seconds, most of the pain from the 8 needles went away. But there was one more thing. The tracking device was twice the size of the one that had been put into him when he was a child. And even though he needed it, he couldn't help but pull at the restraints holding his arm. The pain was searing, as if molten iron had been injected instead of a tracking device, but it was worth it. The autodoc released him, and the light on the plastic card moved, showing him where to go next. This time it led him to the Elite Enclave. He stopped at the gate where several robot guards scanned him meticulously, their cold eyes ensuring only the elite could pass into the city's inner sanctum. Warren was an intruder in their meticulously curated utopia, tolerated only by the virtue of his ticket. When he showed it, the robots scrutinized him, their sensors humming ominously. One finally turned and sprayed him with water, and then a powerful perfume, cleaning him enough so he wouldn't offend the elite. His eyes were watering from the perfume, as he barely saw the robots step out of the way. He walked through the gate, feeling cleaner than he had in months. The area inside the Elite Enclave was different from anything Warren had ever seen. Every house stood alone, with large patches of grass between. The streets were barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. He walked for at least 2 miles, careful not to wander off the road onto the grass, while occasionally dodging out of the way of one of the automated delivery vehicles. The card led him down several streets until he reached a 3-story building with a wide cobblestone path leading to the glass doors. It looked almost as ornate as the corporate headquarters, though the other was over 100 stories tall. As he approached, he saw a human, an actual human, sitting behind the window. The bored teenager was wearing a yellow shirt with Time Agent printed on it, instead of a name tag. She glanced up at him, her disgust apparent on her face. But when he showed her the card, she took it and said,
"You may enter. Period-appropriate clothing will be provided."
Then as he left, he heard her pick up the phone and say,
"One of them is here. No, I don't know how. But he had a ticket."
The inside of the building was made of polished metal and stone. Along the walls, there were TVs showing different eras. As he walked, the teen girl watched him carefully, her head leaning out from behind the door. Warren made his way to a small room where he found clothes that were cleaner and nicer than anything he had ever worn. They were also more complex, with zippers and buttons that took him a moment to figure out. With his clothes on, he picked up the small bag of things. The most important, or so he understood, was what they called a wallet. It had proof of who he was and currency for the era that he was visiting. There were hundreds of dollars inside. Far more than anyone could spend in the 2 weeks he would be there, or so he imagined, but he knew that most of the people who took these trips were the elite, and they expected and deserved a much more expensive lifestyle than Warren. The traveling room was the first place that felt familiar. Unlike the rest of this place, it had to be designed for a purpose and not simply for aesthetics. The metal grid on the wall began to hum, and as it heated up in the room, the metal began to glow. Sparks came from the wall, hitting him, but while they weren't comfortable, they were less painful than the scratches he got on his hands every day picking scrap. Then the entire room blazed with a blinding light, searing through his eyelids and enveloping him in a sensation of being torn apart and stitched back together. His body felt electrified, and he felt weaker than he had since the food riots. Then the light disappeared almost entirely, and he found himself on the street. For a second, as he looked around, he thought he had been tricked. This looked similar to the neighborhoods he lived in. But it was far newer and cleaner. As he began to walk, he saw people. That wasn't odd, the city was always crowded. What was odd was that almost everyone he saw was dressed and acting like the elite. One of the men, older than anyone Warren had ever seen, nodded at him. That struck him as odd, but then he remembered that he was dressed in the clothing of one of the elite too. Was it really possible that they thought he was one of them? He glanced around and saw a sign for a restaurant. That was one of the words that he had learned when preparing for the trip. In his own time, it would have just read food. There were tables and stools at the bar. Not knowing the customs, he walked up and sat on a stool. A woman approached and said,
"What can I get you?"
Do you have food?
He asked, remembering that in his haste he hadn't eaten his daily ration. The woman slid a small bowl of nuts over to him.
How much?
He asked, his stomach growling.
"They're free as long as you're drinking and tipping,"
The woman said. The idea of food being free made no real sense to Warren, but then that was why he was on vacation, so he fumbled for his wallet and pulled out one of the pieces of paper in it.
How much will this get me?
The woman looked at it, and then slid the bowl in front of him and said,
"Plenty. Is beer okay?"
Beer was one of the few things Warren had regularly, 2 large mugs each day if he earned enough. They made up almost half of his daily calories. But the beer she slid in front of him was different, clear with no chunks, just some foam on top. He drank it faster than he should have, while finishing off most of the bowl of nuts. The woman watched him and said,
"Have you been on a diet or something?"
After a few more beers and several more bowls of nuts, Warren felt something he didn't think he had ever felt before. He had eaten too much. The bartender called him a taxi, and when he couldn't tell her where home was, had him dropped off at a local motel. At the motel, he signed a few things he didn't fully understand, and then was put into a room that was both bigger and nicer than any sleeping room he had ever seen. There was a bed that could sleep 4 people, and a TV he couldn't figure out how to turn on. He fell asleep, but was woken sometime later by a rattling and the sound of wind. He assumed something must be wrong, Then he saw that there was something against the wall that was blowing out cold air. He had of course seen air filters in a few places, but that hardly seemed necessary here, since the air was clean. With the cold air helping to reinvigorate him, he looked more carefully around the room. The bed was so soft it was almost hard to sleep on, and the door could be locked from the inside. Then he found the toilet. There were some toilets in his time, but most places just had buckets or holes, and it was very rare for them to have water. Then he found the shower. He knew people in this time cleaned themselves daily, and he found that he could get warm or cold water. He tried it warm after some experimentation and found that it was better than he had expected, and even after being sprayed down by the robots and the clean clothes, the water that came off him was still almost black. Once the water was clear, he tested the other things. One had an image of someone with foam in their hair, so he tried that. It stung his eyes, but it wasn't all that bad. Then he got dressed and made his way out of the room. There was a siren as he stepped outside, and the bars on the window almost reminded him of home. He even saw a broken glass bottle on the ground. Not a huge prize in this time, but in his own, that would have been at least 10% of his daily pay. Not that anyone could afford to leave that much glass on the ground. As he stood there, he realized for the first time that he really didn't have anything to do. But there were a few things he was interested in. He had heard that back in the 21st century, people went to school. And since he didn't have anything else to do, he started towards the school. As he approached the area, he began to see signs. He could only read a few of the words, but the buildings were impressive. Not as large as the corporate buildings in his time, and they looked older but not worn. Then he saw him, Tyler Dentron. Warren had seen dozens of statues of him in his time. They marked the edges of each district in the city. Monuments to a man whose decisions had sculpted their society. But the one that looked most like this young man was the one that stood proudly in front of the Vexus headquarters, a silent guardian of his legacy. Warren knew he wasn't supposed to interact with anyone he knew or recognized. But what harm could it really do? It wasn't as if Warren could change the life of one of the elites so easily. So he approached the young man, whose future influence would be felt in every corner of society, and said,
"Hey Tyler. What's up?"
Tyler looked up at him and said,
"Do I know you?"
Thinking as fast as he could, Warren said,
"Probably not. I'm Warren. We went to the same school. John said you were here and that I should look you up. Can I buy you a beer and you can tell me about this place?"
I have a big test tomorrow. Can this wait?
It's just that I don't even know where to eat. And it won't take long. I mean, I don't know anyone here.
As Tyler seemed to change his mind, Warren felt a cold chill run through him. Warren looked more carefully at the man, then at the small picture on the card. He didn't fully remember why he had decided to speak to Tyler. But it was on the itinerary. His travel agent probably knew something he didn't. So once he got back, he could find out who he was, and it would be a story worth telling. If it wasn't, Warren wouldn't have wasted his precious time coming here. After all, he only had a few more days before his yearly vacation would be over, and he'd have to get back to his time and the office grind. So when the young man looked at him, Warren gave him his best salesman smile and said,
"Just one drink."
But Warren knew it wouldn't be just one drink. He had closed far too many meetings by convincing people of one drink, and then keeping that going. Once at the bar, Warren paid the waitress extra, telling her to make sure to keep Tyler's drink topped up. And with each drink he felt another of those chills. He knew those were meant to be warnings. Hints that time itself was changing. But Warren hadn't risen to the top of the business world by being afraid to take risks. So he questioned Tyler, carefully recording their conversation. By the end of the conversation, Warren was still clueless as to why he had believed that this young man would make a good subject for his next novel. He had assumed that there must be something special about him, but he seemed in almost every way average, except perhaps for his ego, which was certainly oversized, but he didn't need research to write about someone that full of himself. Warren had known plenty of people like that. Once Tyler had drunk enough to fall asleep with his head on the table, Warren paid the tab and hailed a taxi. They weren't as nice as the ones in his own time, having an actual driver that he had to interact with. But he was mostly worried about the environmental damage it did. Most of the damage to the world had been reversed, and he knew one taxi ride wouldn't really change anything, but he still felt an obligation to be careful. The last thing he wanted to do was change things for the worse. While he tried his best to ignore the driver, Warren carefully read over his datapad, seeking out his notes on Tyler Dentron. He had been a mediocre student. The only thing he could find that made a good story was that he had applied for an honors class that included Elsie Yamazaki, one of the members of the team that had discovered time travel. That meant Tyler had just missed out on greatness thanks to a couple of poor grades. And Warren thought that might make an interesting story. The life of someone who hated the new, more egalitarian order, because it didn't give him the chance to prove how much better he was than anyone else. A greatness that he knew to be true, despite everything in his life showing it wasn't. But the idea just wasn't enough to carry a book. Perhaps he could be a side character. But even that idea faded, as Warren said.
Take me to the business district. I always wondered what the world looked like when corporations shaped every aspect of life.
I enjoy writing about time travel because it gives me a chance to examine how small changes can affect the world in ways we might never expect. But I think there's a flaw in this too. It's easy to give overweighted value to the actions of the time traveler, but that isn't an accurate view. A time traveler is no more important than anyone else. The difference is that when Warren, Marty, or Sam go back in time, we can see the changes they make. Meanwhile, the changes we make are less easy for us to see. That's because, unlike someone who goes back in time, we're not the only ones working to change things. There are billions of us, each making decisions, each changing the world in ways that may be tiny or may be profound. And we can never know which it is. Perhaps calling an old friend may encourage them to follow a dream, or perhaps it will distract them from something else they could have done. There is no way any of us can know. What I do know is that the future is ours to create. That no matter how much it may at times feel like we have no control, there is no way to know that. So the only reasonable and responsible thing to do is treat your actions as if they matter. Because even if they won't shape the foundations of history, they will shape your life and the life of those around you. And that's important too. If you enjoy this, you can get more of my thoughts and more stories every week by signing up for my newsletter at scifi.com. Or if you want some say in what I write next, you can become a free member at patreon.com/Elton and vote on my monthly story theme. And if you want to help me keep doing these, you can sign up for my Patreon and get access to over 40 patron exclusive stories at any donation level. Thank you, Elton Gar.